Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort. Are you crooked, son of a bitch? Yeah, I think that's all right. Forgot where I was, except for the fact that I'm me. We are here for part 7 of a 10-part series as we journey through the daunting novel that is and has been and will always be Absalom, Absalom. And this is the chapter that was 7. The daunting chapter 7. The formidable chapter 7. The 394-page 2-sentence chapter 7. So, what happened in this chapter? We're back with Quentin and Shreve as they deal with an environment most dastardly to a pair of southern boys, a northeastern winter. Quentin is relaying a story about that funny French architect that Sutpen had employed all those years ago. In the time that he ran away, Quentin's grandfather helped Sutpen and Sutpen's slaves track down the architect, who, by the time he was found, attempted seemingly a type of suicide by cop, rushing out at the men and the dogs, etc. And we're going to get back to that a little bit, that sentiment a little bit later. But these are tales being told to the grandfather Compson by Sutpen, sitting in the dark like Quentin and Shreve. Sutpen told the general of his formative years, and they were sitting in an environment very comfortable to the two, the dark and mysterious hot woods. Turns out Sutpen's daddy was a drunkard and seemingly a bit of a journeyman. The Sutpen family ended up in West Virginia, from where Thomas Sutpen would run away to start his own life, and just sort of end up teleporting to the West Indies. Didn't know how he got there. No one knows how he got there. No one knows how he knew where to go. No one knows how he knew that was the spot to be. He just sort of ended up there, much like he just sort of ends up in this story as he is introduced in the very first chapter. It was in the West Indies that he started his first franchise. If you have ever read Fight Club, you know exactly what I'm talking about, by marrying an important man's daughter after a spat of violence with what would have been a slave revolt. And he has, with that woman, a son, Charlie Good himself. But when Sutpen learns that his wife, and thereby his son, were part black, he took his slaves and left his family. Thomas is not the type to cuddle. So Sutpen goes and does Sutpen things until his new son, Henry, brings home his old son, Charles Bond, as a playmate, who then, Bond that is, falls in love with Sutpen's only daughter, Judith. There are so many twists and turns in this one family story that it's hard to even remember the names while I'm relaying it. Well, I don't know what I wrote down here. I have no idea what this word is. Anyway, Sutpen, learning of all of this, tells Henry that Bond is his brother. And Henry sort of says, meh, so, who cares? which is weird considering that Charles is about to marry his sister, who's also Bond's sister. Sort of weird and backwards turn. So, knowing the proclivities that run through the family, Sutpen tells Henry that Bond is black. And Henry says, that's it, I've had it, and we know what happens after that. We've already got that part of the story. Henry kills the hell out of him. Sutpen then, as we've seen, returns from the war, becomes depressed, and becomes a drunkard, much as his father has, and ends up taking up with Wash Jones' granddaughter, who I think I might have introduced as Wash Jones' daughter in the previous video in this series. It's all so hard to keep track of. He often gifts her ribbons and beads that the town folk just know where they came from. Her name, Millie, said granddaughter, becomes pregnant, and Wash Jones sort of tries to wish/ignore it away. It in very strange context for the character who idolizes Sutpen, just worships Sutpen, but does not want to believe this about Sutpen and his granddaughter. So he just sort of tries to ignore it until the day that she gives birth to that child. On that day, Sutpen had come over and said, you know, it's too bad you're not a horse, because if you were a horse, you and your baby, I'd have a good place for you. What the hell? Wash, overhearing this and knowing that it is true that by this time Sutpen is not going to do right by Millie, which I suppose is the final straw. I'm not sure. This is where Wash goes ahead and kills him. Dead. Kills him dead with a Sith, right? Not an S-I-T-H, an S-C-Y-T-H-E. So the town folk show up to arrest him, and then he goes ahead and he kills Millie. He kills the baby. And he does his best suicide by cop act by charging the townfolk who came to arrest him with the same knife that he killed his granddaughter and great-grandchild. Because as we leave this chapter, we are left with this haunting and or disappointing and or very telling quote. This is, we are back with Shreve and Quentin. Wait, Shreve said. This is right at the end of this story as we're watching all of the stuff with Wash Jones play out. You mean that he got the son he wanted after all that trouble, he being Sutpen, and then he turned right around and interrupts? Yes. Sitting in grandfather's office that afternoon with his head kind of flung back a little, explaining to grandfather like he might have been explaining arithmetic to Henry in the 4th grade. You see, all I wanted was just a son, which seems to me, when I look at my contemporary scene, no exorbitant gift from nature or circumstance to demand, will you wait, Shreve said. With that with the son he went to all that trouble to get lying right there behind him in the cabin, he would have to taunt the grandfather into killing him first, and then the child too. What? Quentin said. It wasn't a son, it was a girl. Oh, Shreve said. Come on, let's get out of this damn icebox and go to bed. how throwaway and disposable the women folk seemingly would have been. So, what do we want to talk about in this chapter? I think one thing that definitely deserves to be talked about is, so there's the quote, he went to the West Indies, which isn't really explained. He, being Sutpen, it's not explained in these stories how he knew where to go, how he knew what to do, how he knew with whom he must gain employ, any of those things. It is just as mysterious as it was when he, Sutpen, showed up. I'm speaking like this novel now. I'm putting people's names in parentheses. But as Sutpen showed up in the first place, just sort of like that kiln earlier in the novel, he just seemingly is able to manifest things which would help him along the way here, things which would be beneficial to him, so long as those things are not people. He must pry, Sutpen, his way into people's lives. He must show up, become grandiose, the way he did with the slave revolt, the way he did with the house, assert himself as a dominant force, the way he did in his first marriage, the way he did by building out that plantation, and then accrue those things which he thinks it is that someone such as him is supposed to do. Isn't this how a psychopath acts? A psychopath is often very successful because they see what they are supposed to do and they say, oh, that's all I've got to do. I've got to do that, and then I'm successful. Successful is what you want to be. That means this is what I need to have. Let me accrue it, which is fine when you're talking about cars, which is fine when you're talking about money, which is fine when you're talking about houses, which is fine when you're talking about things, not fine when you're talking about people, and therein lies the rub. The psychopathic mindset does not see other people as people, but things. And here, he, Sutpen, is needing that son, that thing, the final thing, the thing by which he is to be survived. But he doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. It is also possibly, Thomas Sutpen, American Psycho, it is also possibly necessary to take into account all of the West that is going on around Thomas Sutpen. Thomas Sutpen moves from basically the middle of nowhere to what is known as West Virginia. Then he goes to what is known as the West Indies. The West, holds a very special place in the American mythos. This novel takes place in 1909. By this time, Oklahoma had been a state very briefly. New Mexico and Arizona were not yet states. They weren't even states. So the West has not always meant westward. That's one of the tricky things about the American mythos, is that the West has not always meant California, for example, a state that had, at the time of the Civil War, not even for a generation been a state. So what we're looking at when we're looking at quote unquote the West is an ideal which is very rough, very rugged, very by the soil of the earth, very grab your bootstraps and pull yourself up, very masculine, very you wake up and get straight to work. These are all things that we are not even tempted but forced to associate with Thomas Sutpen. And it is interesting because He, he does just get up and do it. Everything he has, he just goes ahead and does. He is, however, disassociative, as we have discussed. So, one of the most confounding things that must be to someone who is considered psychopathic is the dichotomy between person and thing. If we're looking at Thomas Sutpen as sort of this classical psychopathic type of figure, and the reason that must be confounding is because if the psychopath doesn't really associate other people with feelings and emotions and being people, what are the odds that he or she confuses himself, herself, with those same things? After all, here we have this stunning image of Thomas Sutpen as just a force of nature. That force of nature, it's hard to say, really gets up in the morning and says, by God, just don't have it today. Think I'm going to roll back over and go to sleep. So can a person be faulted for treating others as things when he or she treats himself or herself as a thing? Or is it just part of that person's nature? I think that this is a stunning representation of that mindset, especially as people with fifis, people in their feelings, people that do see people as people. On 198 here, so Thomas Sutpen is mythologized. Here on 198, Sutpen was talking about it again, telling him again before he realized that this was some more of it, and he said how he thought how there was something about a man's destiny, or about the man, that caused the destiny to shape itself to him like his clothes did, like the same coat that might have fitted 1,000 men, yet one man has worn it for a while. It fits no one else, and you can tell it anywhere you see it, even if you see its sleeve or lapel, so that the demon's, Shreve said, destiny had fitted itself to him. Here we have the reemergence of Thomas Sutpen as the demon, and it is him as the demon in correlation. He's reintroduced as the demon in correlation to destiny, right? In correlation to musing about his destiny, we have the reemergence of Thomas Sutpen being pinned to the demon moniker. Why? In the passage, the destiny is very much linked to sort of God and religion. It's just sort of, that's what the man's destiny is, what it is. It is hard. In fact, that is sort of predeterminism, predestination. These are all ideas that are pretty heavily linked to monotheisms, as monotheisms are basically saying that the God that is all-powerful and all-knowing. For a God to be all-knowing, a God has to know all that will be. For a God to know all that will be means that your story has already taken place, and to this story, God is privy. So this is why oftentimes in mythologies, the person who is struggling against their destiny always comes to a terrible ending. What is that dynamo of Thomas Sutpen's work ethic and spirit if it is not the struggle against destiny? Is this why he is seen as the demon. Is this why? So a few episodes ago, I think it was the second or third episode in the series, I talked a lot about the building of mythos, and there was some pushback in the comments. I talked about this type of storytelling as the building of mythology, and I think there was pushback. In the South, that's just how we talk about everyone. My point, I think, if I had one, assuming I had one, was that these two are one and the same. Mythology and religion and gossip are all the same. These are the ways that we communicate. And because of that, these stories being told and retold and retold and retold, they always accrue a little bit more meaning down the generations, just like a religious text does. So every time the story of Sutpen is told, he's acting a little less person-like. He's a little more successful. He's a little more distant. Rosa was a little bit more of a badass. Henry was a little bit more taken by Bon and his spirit. All of these things grow and grow and grow. Because if the story is going to be told and retold, the person telling it has to understand that that story means something to them. And the story never finds its way out in the first draft. Every story we tell about, pretend maybe you had a bad boss, you tell that story in the back of your head time and time again before you ever tell it to anyone else. That story must build and take meaning in your head. So you're constantly trying to figure out why that story is bugging you so much, what those things are that you want to convey about that said bad boss. So you build those points up a little bit more. And I think that is how Thomas Sutpen goes from roughshod figure to the very definition of the West, to the demon, all of these things. But there are things which come through on page 200. So he learned the language. This is as he, Sutpen explaining all of the things that he did. And you do it because you have to. You go into the West Indies, you got to learn the language. So he learned the language just like he did to be a sailor, I reckon, because grandfather asked him why he didn't get himself a girl to live with and learn it the easy way. And grandfather said how he sat there with the firelight on his face and his beard, and his eyes quiet and sort of bright, and said, and grandfather said that it was the only time he ever knew him to say anything quiet and simple. On this night I am speaking of, and until my first marriage, I might add, I was still a virgin. You will probably not believe that, and if I were to try to explain it to you, you would disbelieve me more than ever. So I will only say that too was a part of the design which I had in my mind. And grandfather said, why shouldn't I believe it? And he, looking at grandfather still with a quiet, bright expression about the eyes, saying, but do you? Surely you don't hold me in such small contempt as to believe that at 20 I could neither have suffered temptation nor offered it? And grandfather said, you're right. I shouldn't believe it, but I do. Dichotomies of character. This guy who seemed so powerful and evil was still a virgin at 20 when he was married. So I think that is sort of what I really have to say about Sutpen, which is the crux of the matter here. But Sutpen was also, we see this twice in this chapter. Sutpen's gravity was such that people in its proximity just knew they had to do what they had to do, and they had to do what it was for which they were acquired by Sutpen. In the form of the architect, He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't do it. He couldn't live. Remember, he was sleeping on a floor. He couldn't live like an animal anymore. He ran away. So when they got him back, he didn't really want to go, and he tried this little dramatic suicide by cop by rushing out at the group that was there to apprehend him. Because imagine that mindset. I don't want to go back. I don't want to do it. I'm not doing this anymore. This life that I've got is done and over. I can't end it, but I sure could tempt someone else to do that. Because of the gravity of falling back into that life is unavoidable. We see it again at the end of this chapter with Wash Jones. He did not want the life even after Sutpen was gone, he didn't want the life that was to be presented for him, that was left for him. So not only did he kill his granddaughter, not only did he kill his great-granddaughter, he attempted that suicide by cop. And all of these things are very big ideas. All of these things are very, they're life-encompassing ideas. The idea of the mythos, the idea of religion, the idea of the life that you will have to lead. I'm about to turn 35 years old, and I find myself in a bit of a rut. And I'm in one of those places where you can project out the next 20 years of your life if everything goes as it's going now. Do you want to do that? And it's one of those feelings that you feel like you have to either act irrationally or accept the rational. This is sort of the midlife crisis, the quarter-life crisis, all of these things. But Sutpen's gravity has forced these people into that decision in a moment, as opposed to a prolonged three-year-long period where you buy an expensive car and you leave your wife and you find a woman half your age, all of these things that are indicative of the midlife crisis or the quarter-life crisis, where you move halfway across the country and you try your hand at some big career as opposed to job, all of these things that we associate with quarter and midlife crises. Thomas Sutpen is a crisis, forces the breaking point. And there's one more idea that I think sort of plays into this whole thing and plays into remember we talked a little bit earlier about you tell these stories time and again in your own head, and they pick up meaning, and they pick up the meaning that you need them to. Here on page 210, maybe nothing ever happens once and is finished. Maybe happen is never once, but like ripples, maybe on water after the pebble sinks. The ripples moving on, spreading the pool attached by a narrow umbilical water cord to the next pool, which the first pool feeds, has fed, did feed. Let this second pool contain a different temperature of water, a different molecularity, having seen, felt, remembered, reflected in a different tone, the infinite unchanging sky. It doesn't matter that pebble's watery echo, whose fall it did not even see, moves across its surface too, at the original ripple space, to find the old ineradicable rhythm. That is how this story is being told. Thomas Sutpen was the pebble thrown into the lake being our quaint little town. The ripples of Thomas Sutpen having been thrown into the West Indies reverberate back, echo back into the ripple of our current story. And this, it's just a hell of a quote, isn't it? And I imagine, a number of people have told me that they did take me up on YouTubing William Faulkner himself to hear the rhythm at which he reads his own writing. And imagine this passage in his reading. But there's a couple more quotes before we leave that I think bear repeating here. On 201 to 202. The sheen on the dollars was not from gold, but from blood. That's a short one, and I just kind of like it. On 209, the South would realize that it was now paying the price for having erected its economic edifice, not on the rock of stern morality, but on the shifting sands of opportunism and moral brigandage. Those are great quotes. Faulkner has no shortage of great quotes. But that is all that I have for this, the 7th in a 10-part series as we journey through Absalom by William Faulkner. I hope to have you back next week for Chapter 8, and then Chapter 9, and then the review.